Okay.
Hey, hello everyone, and thank you for joining Regenerative Travel's February session of Regenerative Shift, our webinar series where we explore solutions that can reverse climate change through a paradigm shift in regenerative thinking. I'm O'Shannon Burns, and I'm Regenerative Travel's ecosystem steward. I work with the members of our hotel collection to draw out best practice from their great work that they're doing on the ground so that we can share it with others who are on their own journey to travel in a way that aligns with their values. And it is my pleasure to host our discussion today on regenerative ranching. Ranching is an essential part of our heritage here in the United States where I live. And as I spoke to the panelists who are joining us today, I was reminded that when we think about both land conservation and reversing climate change, the lands inhabited by people are essential to this conversation, not only because we humans have inhabited so much of the earth, but also because both people and animals tend to move toward land that is rich and biodiverse. And so we really can't segregate people from nature, and we need to talk about what is happening on privately and communally held land. That's what we'll be focusing on today, and I'm happy to welcome our panelists who have such an interesting diversity of experience related to ranching and conserving rangelands, which comes from the extensive amount of time that they all have spent working in wild lands. They have been out there getting their hands dirty, doing the work. And so Duke Phillips is the CEO and founder of Rangelands, which is a conservation-minded family ranching business in the North American West that includes bison and cattle operations, hospitality, art, and education. He oversees a growing number of ranches. Just the other day when I spoke to him, he was on a new ranch. And through their innovative operations, they aim to promote land conservation, the American ranching legacy, and the quality of life for people living and working on and near ranches. Delane Atcity has 26 plus years of hands-on experience in agriculture and natural resource management, and he has worked on ranches across the American Southwest, including advising the 110-acre tribal farm Navajo agricultural products industry. Through Indian Nations Conservation Alliance and multiple board positions, he partners with Native producers to increase the productivity and profitability of their land while strengthening the circle of life through Indigenous conservation practices. Leslie Allison has worked with private landowners and multiple stakeholders to sustain working lands and support rural communities over the past 3 decades. And at Western Landowners Alliance, she advances policies and practices that ensure private and leased public lands in the Western United States are resilient to stressors, are healthy and biologically diverse, and provide for prosperous rural business and critical ecological services. Previously, she managed a large ranch herself in the southern San Juan Mountains of Colorado for 16 years. And rounding out our panel, we have Charles Trout and Neovita Sianga from African People and Wildlife. They both bring their deep experience in conservation to the panel. Charles co-founded African People and Wildlife with a mission to create win-win solutions for people and wildlife in Tanzania that would be driven by the needs and interests of local people. And Neo oversees their rangeland management program, working with rural communities to monitor the quality of pastures and actively manage Tanzanian rangelands to benefit rural people and wild animals in the long term. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. And before we dive into the topic of regenerative ranching and the issues that are top of mind for you all, I actually want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about what ranching even is, because there's a gap between what many of us know from books and movies and what is actually happening on the ground. Duke, can you kick us off by sharing a little bit about what ranching is from your perspective, a little bit of the history of ranching in the United States and how that connects to your own personal work?
Sure. Thank you, Shannon. Um, when I think of ranching, I see it as an industry that can harvest a renewable resource that cannot be harvested in many other ways by cattle. It's also a tradition that is unique to the United States. It wasn't brought over on the ships from Europe, such as Easter or Christmas or things like that. And I think that it's part of our culture. It's become part of our culture. I mean, there's a saying such as "Let's cowboy up," meaning let's get up and get do some good stuff. I think also that ranching is one of the most misunderstood lifestyles or industries there is, and it's really ironic because there's completely opposing viewpoints, such as the American cowboy riding across the landscape, shooting his gun in the air, or sitting on the side of a hill, chewing on a piece of grass, surveying the landscape, highly romanticized, glamorized lifestyle. And then on the other side, opposite of that is ranching can be seen as a mining process, where you're actually taking from the land and it's being anti-ecological. And both are false. So it's an interesting thing. I think that ranching is the most compelling alternative to large-scale conservation in the American West. And that's our part of our legacy, and it's part of our future. It's what's going to take ranchlands into the future as an industry and as part of our culture in the United States. We can get into a lot more details on why I think that is, but basically, ranchers have lived on the ground. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that comes from people who've lived on the land, who've passed traditions and knowledge down generation by generation. It's also a way cattle and livestock pay their own way. And so it's a way that conservation can be financed. In the conservation world, one of the most difficult things to do is to raise money for operations. So it's a built-in economic thing that ranching brings. And then the cattle are a tool for manipulating the surface of the ground as well to achieve conservation values that emulate the large ungulate herds in the past that would come across the land and recycle nutrients, and they would stir up the land, break down the brittle plants that would be, and put them on the ground so they could recycle, and then they leave for months or years. And so you have a combination of people, a tool for regeneration, and the economic way of paying for it all, as opposed to just being really fun. I mean, we're working outside, so I don't even view it as work.
There's a little bit of fun too.
A lot of fun.
Celine, I'd love to hear from you on this as well. When you and I spoke before, you talked also about the United States history of ranching and how it's been a part of tribal life since the 1600s.
Yeah, it even goes back further than the 1600s. The tribes utilizing the bison and, burning swaths of land and having the bison migrate to those areas, and then they can hunt them and kind of follow them throughout in the large regions of the United States. So, if ranching might have started back then because you're using the animals to manipulate the land and also as a food source. But our modern form of ranching was brought here in the mid 1500s, 1550, by the Spanish conquistadors. At that time, they brought livestock over to fuel their incursions throughout the Southwest. And then they established homes here and started to build on it. It wasn't until the 1670s, when there was a major drought at that time. That's when some of the nomadic tribes would come to the pueblos and to the Spanish villages to raid the resources due to the drought. And then they would take the livestock at that time. But at a large scale, it wasn't until 1680 during the Pueblo Revolt when the Pueblos teamed together to push the Spanish back down to Mexico. And that's when a lot of livestock and horses were left behind. And that's when, it started in this part of the world, and it started to spread out throughout the Western states and throughout the America. At that time, it was common to have multi-species grazing. It wasn't just cattle. And a lot of our tribal ranchers would graze long, huge areas of land where their winter and summer grazing might be separated by 80 miles. And they would just slowly work that path back and forth. So that's kind of the start of ranching in our area.
Yeah, really interesting. Charles and Neo, I'm really grateful to have your experience on the panel too, because Tanzania's rangelands are communal. They often border parks and they have their own history, which makes your management challenges quite different. Can you talk a little bit about that for those people tuning in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Shannon, for putting us together here. Yeah, just to give you a little bit of an overview and the context. It's interesting listening to the ranching dialogue that started off and hearing some of the traditional histories. Tanzania, we have vast protected areas. Nearly 40% of this country is under formal protection. So we have a situation that you might often see maybe sort of in the Yellowstone area, where you have these areas set aside purely for wildlife. But surrounding all of those areas are, indigenous communities that are predominantly pastoralist. And that means it's their villages, which is, can range from anywhere between 4,000 to 8,000 people that are sharing a resource with wildlife. Most of our protected areas, the wildlife migrates out of that protected area for anywhere between a couple months to more than half the year, where they will share the resources with the local communities. And we have a situation where the communities are not then allowed to go into the national parks and use those resources. So you end up with a scenario where natural resource management is critical, not only from a human perspective, given the levels of population growth that we see across Africa, but also, critical resources for these, huge wildlife populations that are also dependent on those areas. So for us, it's really about trying to take on and empower communities with whatever tools are necessary to, really reinvigorate their cultural and traditional practices, the way they used to manage these landscapes and coexist with wildlife, and sort of modernize, or adapt them to sort of a more modern world with slightly different pressures. And of course, I'll let Neo talk in a little more detail what that means. But if you can kind of picture this scenario of, communities, again, ranchers herding livestock, cattle, goats, sheep across plains, very similar to what you see behind Neovitis there, where at the same time you can have zebra, thousands of wildebeest, buffalo, elephant, gazelles, all sharing that landscape at the same time.
So yeah, to add up on that, one of the biggest challenges that we see is the degradation of the traditional systems. Most of these rangelands are owned by communities, as Charles pointed out. And so they are the ones that used to take care of them. They used to monitor them to see how productive they are, send out warriors to go out and check if the grass is ready to be grazed by livestock. And so what we did with our community-based rangeland monitoring and management is to take all that vast traditional system for monitoring and managing rangelands and put it in a modern way, in a way that can be translated easily. So apparently we are using the Esri system, Arc Online, to gather information that is needed by the communities on the condition of rangelands. And some of the criteria the communities came up with includes issues like invasive species, bare grounds, etc., etc. And each and every month we sit down together with community leaders and decide on how to manage the grazing lands. If we have to rest a piece of pasture, if we have to uproot invasive species, if we have to do control burning, among others. And along the way, we have seen a lot of success and success stories, including, there are some parts that haven't been used by wildlife that, we have started seeing wildlife coming back into these areas, but also creating corridors and migratory routes for wildlife from one national park to another. But also, this has also reduced conflicts among communities, especially while looking for pasture, water, and other resources. Yeah.
Interesting. That's actually a great segue to my next question, which is for you, Leslie. Now I do want to turn to the question of regenerative ranching. What is it? How do we define it? And what are the key elements of it? And I think Neo was starting to talk about some of the elements that make it somewhat different from some conventional forms of farming.
Yeah, so there's different, I think, levels at which we want to talk about regenerative ranching, and it's worth noting at the outset that some people in the agricultural community can see that as a divisive word because it sort of sorts out, the good and the bad kind of a thing. And the truth is, in most landscapes, people are trying to do the right thing. They have a certain set of circumstances and resources to work with, and so we want to be a little bit careful about those kinds of judgments and really help bring people along from where they are and what capacities they have. So I just put that right out at the beginning. But that said, I think at the very highest level, regenerative ranching is what is really the goal of what we hear from people all over the West. When we sit down with ranchers all over the West, they over and over will tell you, I really want to leave the world a better place than I found it. I want to leave this ranch a better place. I want to leave my community a better place. And that has a number of different levels. It starts with, of course, caring with land, but also caring for the community and families, that are associated with that land and all the resources that that land supports. So there's this very holistic way of looking at regenerative ranching, which contemplates all those different angles and how they fit together. And we're looking right now at metrics that look beyond simply pasture health in terms of defining success in regenerative activities, right? So that there's social, economic metrics that go along with this. And that's what makes really enduring conservation. If all of those metrics align, then you have something that will last and not be divisive. So that it's the very highest level. And then I think, again, Aldo Leopold said, we really need to be thinking about land as a living community to which we belong. And so regenerative agriculture ranching is about nourishing the whole of that community and fulfilling our responsibility in it. When you step down to more specific levels about practices, I think most people think about regenerative ranching or regenerative grazing in terms of specific sets of practices. Alan Savory made a lot of that famous. The idea of rotational grazing has been around for a long time, before Savory came along. But I think fundamentally what we're talking about is, methods of grazing livestock that intersperse periods of disturbance where you've got, grazing, you've got the manure that is fertilizing, you've got hoof action, which is helping break up soil and retain water. So you introduce livestock to a grassland system, it creates disturbance and nature thrives in disturbance, but then you move them on and allow sufficient rest for the plants to recover. And so it's really inserting prescribed rest with disturbance regimes. And the way to do that varies depending on which landscapes you're in and how many water resources you have. And so I think the danger is becoming overly prescriptive about what those practices might be. What happens in Missouri is very different than what happens in the arid rangelands of New Mexico, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, it varies. And so it's really about adaptive management. It's about knowledge of plant physiology, rangeland ecology, integrating that knowledge with, the resources, the infrastructure that is available on that specific piece of land, constantly learning and adapting, so that the end goal is, of course, healthier soils, more resilient landscapes, greater biodiversity, all of those things, plus, sustainable livelihoods for the people that are also part of that landscape. So I think that's kind of the big picture of regenerative ranching.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you. And Charles and Neo, that adaptive management, that I know is exactly what you're trying to foster in the communities that you work with. Again, tapping into indigenous knowledge that's already there and enabling that monitoring through technology. Can you talk a little bit about that in specifics? Because on the communal rangelands where you are, there aren't fences, and there are lots of different stakeholders. So to me, it seems like a really complex scientific puzzle to figure out.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in there a little bit. It is exactly, I think, as you describe it, it is a very complex puzzle, as I think it is anywhere. And as Leslie so clearly pointed out, no one recipe fits every single scenario. So it really is about adaptive management, but it goes a lot more than that. For us, it's about knowing the people who know the land. As both Duke and Delane mentioned, generations upon generations of communities that have been living on that land, managing that land in one form or another. And what we see across substantial parts of Africa is unfortunately tragedies of the commons. Lots of people all just using a resource with very little control or no management whatsoever. So being able to really just, and they recognize that they're in a situation that things have to change. We are losing those resources. Populations are growing. And as Leslie pointed out, they want to leave a better landscape for their children and future generations. And we do see, vast areas slipping away. So being able to sit down and talk about how people used to do things versus what's happening now, and how could we go back to doing things the old way in today's world, which is a little easier said than done, as I'm sure everyone recognizes. So we use some modern tools. We use smartphones, and train community members on how to monitor, and that gets analyzed immediately in the cloud and can be seen and viewed by entire governing bodies within the communities to make decisions for everyone. And so it access to information, kind of putting better power in their hands. And again, just inspiring people to take an interest, and to really think about actively managing their landscapes and trying to make them better.
Yeah, great. And Duke, as a business, how do you see Rangelands embodying this regenerative model that Leslie and Charles have spoken about? And I'm especially interested to hear, maybe some specifics about how the ranching that you're doing is benefiting the ecosystems that you're on, and even addressing climate change, maybe.
That's a lot, Ocean. Well, to me, the word regenerative is the latest word in a really long string of terms that we've been using for the last 20 or 30 years. And it seems as though the regenerative, the word or the concept has, I don't know, Leslie, it seems to have caught on. It seems to spread a lot further into, urban America. So anyway, I guess from my standpoint, I mean, everything that has been said that regenerative means that combines everything, community, ecology, economics, livestock is really right on. I think you can be the best grazer or the best, ecological, be aware of what's going on. But if your wife is not happy, or if your community is not healthy, or if the land isn't prospering, well, then, you might as well just give up. It really is a combination of all these things and being adaptive. One of the big problems with ranching historically is that economically, it's been a very, very thin margin business. So it's not where you want to go if you want to make money. It's a lifestyle. And that has been one of the problems that ranching has caused ecologically, because many times ranchers have no place to go because they get hit with a drought, and all of a sudden they have to get rid of cattle, and it's just a downward spiral. So to me, economics is one of the critical things that needs to happen in order to have the flexibility to get through hard times, whether it's a market or a drought or something like that. So what we try to do is look at land as a multidimensional resource, not just a place where we're going to raise livestock. So how can we use the things that are intrinsic, the amenities that are intrinsic to a piece of land, like a river, or it could be a beautiful mountain, or it could be proximity to a town or to, something else. Every piece of land is unique. And I think every human is unique. So we all are good at what we like doing. So you have to match whatever it is, whether you like riding horses or fishing or roping or people. And so from our standpoint, we look at land in as many different ways as we can, with livestock being the primary economic process that produces income. So we have hospitality, which brings people from all over the world to visit our ranches, to learn about what we do. And even though it's a diversification in terms of economics, it's become more and more, as we get more and more involved, a way to build bridges between the urban and rural environment, because we're sitting out here on a working landscape, and we're not going to get anything done unless we have some kind of support from people who are living, we call it the greater society, 98% of the people who live in cities. And one of the things about Western Landowners Alliance is that one of the goals that Leslie is trying to achieve is, how do we bring all the different people together? So you have people who work in the land, people who bring the financial resources to it, scientists, the whole group of people that is now entering ranching. How do we work together, and how do we communicate? How do we build a strong business so that when it dries up, we don't have to keep the cattle or the bison or the sheep on the land? We can get rid of them so that the land can not be under the same kind of stress. So hospitality has become, how do we get you involved so you get to know what we're doing and why ranching is important, and how do we build bridges in a society where the chasm between the rural nature and cities is growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. We have 2,000 kids that come to our education programs every year, and we see these kids, how thirsty they are for just being outside, just come running off the bus, and they want to see cowboys running across the landscape, shooting guns in the air and so forth. But we also meet the parents and the teachers, and we see this huge growing gulf. So anyway, we have a leather shop, we have a hunting and that manufactures goods that we sell on the internet. We have the hospitality business, hunting and fishing, which have become more and more important from both standpoints.
Yeah, that's great. And Delane, you also are working on a few initiatives to make ranching more economically viable, specifically for Indigenous communities on tribal lands. And you noted that one of the economic issues that really drives this is that ranchers will receive the same price for cattle, whether they're ranching in a regenerative way or not. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you're working on to try and drive up the value of ranching?
Definitely. You know, when I talk to tribal ranchers with the different nations that we work with, you know, I always bring up the fact that the cow costs, how much does it cost you to run that animal and to you know, get it through that year or so. But I also talk about, you know, how are they going to market that blade of grass that animal's eating? You know, are you going to get $2 a pound for sheep or goats? Are you going to get a $1.50 a pound for cattle, or $4.80 a pound for bison? And it all really depends on how well their management skills are fine-tuned to what they're doing. There's a large economy of scale with these tribal nations if they're ever to get organized. You know, they have 55 million acres of tribal rangelands available to do this kind of grazing. So, and you know, like Duke said, there's small profit margins, but if we are to tweak our business model to more turnovers throughout the year, I think that would help benefit what we're trying to accomplish. One thing that we're not touching on is, you know, telling our story, our history behind our ranching heritage, and make a story beef and let people know the story of where this animal came from and how it came to be and how it got to the market. A lot of our cattle is, you know, considered never ever, you know, no antibiotics, no growth hormones. So it is a marketable product, but we just got to get organized. One way we're doing that is at the tribal farm that they have me on the board of directors. We're trying to organize some of the ranchers to utilize our new custom feeding program. And so we'll make that available over the next few years to tribal ranchers so they can bring their cattle off of the main tribal nation and which is affected by tragedy of the commons too. And bring them over to the farm and let them custom graze on pivots for like 3 months, make their cattle more marketable and get that compensatory gain so they can get more value added and also a more profitable product that's available in the market.
Yeah, that's
And,
great.
yeah, and hopefully this will turn into a national branded beef program. So like a Native American branded beef program in the future to sell domestically and maybe internationally, because you know, these tribal reservations, you know, they've been like this for a long time, and I continue to, you know, I see them continuing in the state that they're in, natural resource wise.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Okay, so Leslie, I want to pivot now again a little bit and talk about environmental policy. And you shared with me some interesting cases where environmental policy might actually affect the economic viability of regenerative ranching in a negative way. For example, you shared about some of the unintended effects of the Endangered Species Act here in the United States as a disincentive. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe also explain some of the work that you're doing to help politicians understand the challenges with these policies?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I just want to say that, you know, there are important bedrock environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act that we find, you know, very important. We fully support those kind of laws. It's when, for the most part, and it's when you get down to the implementation that can sometimes, these laws can sometimes create unintended negative consequences. And so the Endangered Species Act for a long time has been controversial across a lot of the ranching community because the way it works is, if you can imagine, people in urban areas and suburbs and, all our transportation corridors and energy fields have displaced wildlife and habitat. So we don't, in my suburb, we don't have any endangered species that I'm aware of here, and most cities don't. And so the ones that are left, the habitats and the species that are left, are often out on these big working lands, these ranches, where somebody has managed to keep that landscape intact so that it is still available to wildlife. Now, let's say that you've got two ranchers. One rancher A does a really great job with doing good stewardship and has a lot of good species on their property, maybe some of the last ones left. Rancher B, maybe they didn't do such a good job. Maybe they converted it to some kind of intensive agricultural use and they don't have so much habitat or species. If a particular species gets listed on the Endangered Species Act, now the guy that has it, because he's been a good steward, or she has been a good steward, and they've got some of the last ones left, that's where the heavy hand of regulation suddenly comes down. And we can say, oh, you can't graze anymore because grazing might interfere with that species need. You open yourself up to litigation by groups that really don't support ranching and just as soon seeing the rancher gone and the species stay. And so that creates costs and problems on the business side. And so in a sense, we threaten to penalize the people who have done the very best for the species. And we need to be supporting and rewarding those rather than punishing them. So, the government has come up with some regulatory assurance agreements that they call them. And the idea being that we can offer to ranchers, hey, if you do a good job for, sage grouse or monarch butterflies or something else, and if they end up getting listed, we're going to promise you that we're not going to penalize you for having been the one that really stepped up to support those species. So that's great, but there's no funding. And those agreements are very difficult. There's a lot that needs to be done to improve the agreements so more landowners can take advantage of them. So that would be a way that we can improve the way that the Endangered Species Act works to support rather than penalize good stewardship. And another example would be rigidity on grazing management on federal lands. Many people are afraid of the term flexibility, but as we've talked about earlier, you have to be flexible. You have to be able to practice adaptive management. You have to be able to monitor and adjust. And sometimes our rigid grazing policies or federal land management policies don't allow that kind of flexibility so that we can adapt to the latest science, to a changing climate. So we're really pushing for policies that give greater flexibility, but with retained accountability. So looking more towards outcomes and being able to work more flexibly with agencies. So those are just a couple of small examples. There's tax policies that trip people up. There's all kinds of policies that the outside world doesn't see that ranchers encounter as barriers when they're trying to do good stewardship.
Yeah, and we actually received a question from the audience, which I'll just take this moment to encourage people attending live to send in your questions if you have them, and we'll try to get to some of them before the webinar ends. But this one is for you, Charles and Neo, and it's somewhat related to what Leslie was just talking about and what Duke was mentioning earlier about this misunderstanding that people have of these landscapes. So the question is from Margaret. An interesting factor that must be included in this discussion on landscapes in East Africa is tourism. It seems that tourists don't want or expect to see locals among wildlife. For example, herding cattle near a tower of giraffes or a herd of elephants, when in reality, that's what's been happening for hundreds of years. Can this sometimes false narrative of wild Africa be detrimental to the rights of local populations that are in favor of tourism and donor funds?
Charles, go ahead.
Go ahead, Neil. I can add in. I think it's an interesting question, particularly for Tanzania that has such vast protected areas. There are no people in those areas. So I do think that there is an opportunity for most tourists that are wishing to see wildlife exclusively. There are plenty of opportunities for that. But what we've been trying to promote over the past decade, I would say, more and more is is the more the cultural tourism side, being able to see both the people and the wildlife at the same time and get a better understanding of the people that have, as you mentioned, historically lived with these animals, hand in hand and shared the landscapes. For us, I think particularly over the course of the last year, as the entire globe has gone into upheaval, for a country like Tanzania that has been so heavily dependent on tourism and tourism income, I think this has really highlighted the fact that particularly for these, these large protected areas, that we need alternate sources of revenue. We really need an alternate form. And as Duke was mentioning, and really interesting listening to Delane as well about the tribal beef, and we've really started looking at opportunities there. Where we do lack is the economic reason for livestock husbandry. Most people here are keeping livestock as a traditional way of life. It's a symbol of status, of wealth. It's not to say that they don't sell livestock, but you're not raising beef for the purpose of sale. It's your bank, it's your stocks, your bonds. And while you do occasionally liquidate some of that, you're not actually producing livestock for the purpose of a cash return. And that in and of itself brings up a whole new questions on a set of questions on how you manage that landscape. It can get overused very quickly. It's particularly if, where you don't have individual control over certain resources. And if you don't have good management structures in place that benefit everyone. So I think you just have to be very conscientious of these changing landscapes and really try and empower the people to make the best decisions for their lives. And, we've really seen it highlighted that, we cannot be entirely dependent on a tourism market here in Tanzania.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, a little bit in addition to what Charles has talked about, with, for example, Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority. It's a unique place where also people and wildlife live in. And we've been working out there for the past 4 years to help them with their rangeland program is a protected area. But we also have wildlife management areas that are owned by communities also. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I kind of, when I pitched Duke earlier, a multi-part question, I want to loop back to one of the things that I referenced, and I think a few of you might have some interesting experience and opinions on this, but as pressure from governments and companies to reduce carbon emissions increases, we're seeing an increasing conversation about how rangelands can play a really important part in this. And because they have massive potential for carbon sequestration. And I'd love to hear, I'm gonna kind of pitch it out to all of you. What do you think about that? Do you see that potential? Are there things that we all could do to advance that? Or what are the barriers that are still there? Because this is another potential revenue stream through carbon offsetting that maybe is not there quite yet, but could be in the future.
I'll jump in a little bit. First off, again, to emphasize that landscapes are really different and precipitation levels are going to have a big influence on some of that question, as are, the role of forests, the relation to forests and woodlands and grasslands. For the Western United States, the Intermountain West specifically, it's a pretty arid place, and the recovery of grasslands, adding more vegetative cover, which is what, leads to sequestration, can take time, especially if there's a degraded landscape. It takes time, and we have weather extremes, and the science right now is very shaky about what it takes to sequester carbon, how long that carbon stays in the soil. There's different types of carbon. It's very expensive to monitor that. It's a very, very tricky space if you just look specifically at soil carbon sequestration. But what is, we know, true is that the rangelands are already sequestering a mass amount of carbon. They are a huge carbon sink, world over. And the loss of those grasslands and open lands is something we can't afford. So one of the big areas of emphasis right now in the carbon discussions is what we call avoided conversion. So avoiding the conversion of these ranch grasslands to some other use that is less carbon friendly, essentially. So we want to make sure that the economics support keeping these lands intact. And that's what everybody's been speaking to here today. It comes down to a question of economics. How do we keep the lands intact? And how do we keep them healthy? And one of the things that we've talked a lot about at Western Landowners is, there's things called co-benefits, right? So if you have a healthy acre of land, it is sequestering as much carbon as it can and should. Like if it's in maximum ecological condition, it's sequestering as much carbon as it probably can and should. It's also infiltrating water, which is really important to all of our worlds. It's supporting the most biodiversity that can and should. It's supporting agricultural productivity. So at the end of the day, those are all co-benefits. And whether you get at those through, one metric or another, they go together. And at the end, the goal is really to keep as many acres whole and healthy as we can. And that is in some ways a more accessible marketplace for some of our more arid rangelands where the science on carbon sequestration is more challenging at the moment. So we're really putting a lot of emphasis there. And I tell people, look, if you've got an acre of hard packed clay ground, that's been kind of hammered and there's no vegetation on it, it's not sequestering carbon, it's not capturing water, it's not supporting biodiversity, and it's not supporting agriculture. If you cover half that acre, that it's starting to sequester carbon and do all those other co-benefits. If you have a healthy acre, it's really at its full potential for all those. So I think we need to look holistically at the whole question of carbon in the context, because biodiversity is the other crisis that we're facing globally right now, not to mention the economics issues that we've been talking about. So I'll pause there.
I think one of the things we're facing also is just how do we quantify. There's a lot of different perspectives on monitoring even, and it has to be simple. It has to be something that can be done easily. Anyway, and the markets are still very young, and so there's still a lot of work ahead of us. But my gut is that one day it's going to be land management, professional land management that's done well is going to be very sought after. But as an aside, I think as important and also part of the question or answering the question is how do we create a consensus around land management? How do we look at it and share knowledge that is not prejudiced or trying to bring forth an agenda? And so bringing people to the land to really meet the people who are working the land and have conversations based on reality, what's actually happening, as opposed to trying to prove a point, is really, really critical. And once that happens, once people realize how important ranching is or grazing is, good grazing, well, then the whole dynamic will change and you create a support base politically, economically, in all ways. And so that would be my dream, is how do you create a group of people who, first of all, understand what needs to happen and what is happening, and then in turn support that. So hospitality is a diversification, but I've already said this before, I think the real important part is you're getting people to the land, and that's the first step. When that happens, well, then all kinds of other things come from that.
Anyone else? Well, that Duke leads really nicely into the next question I have. When I was speaking with Delane earlier, he shared with me that the average age of a rancher in the United States is something like 65 years old. And if there aren't young people who have experience in ranching and regenerative agriculture and rangelands management, these businesses are really at risk of dying out. And it's compounded by the fact that these lands will only be viable in the long term if they are carefully managed, as you all have so eloquently shared. And in many cases, these lands are vulnerable to different kinds of development that wouldn't keep these landscapes as healthy as they are today. So as I spoke to all of you before the webinar, this was really the through line that I saw through all of your work, which is you've all thought deeply about how you can support this next generation of folks who will be on the land. And so I'd like to hear from each of you a little bit about the programs that you have to develop young ranchers and rangeland managers and really create this future version of ranching that's more diverse and regenerative. So Delane, maybe I'll start with you.
Okay. Here at Indian Nations Conservation Alliance, last year we started our first pilot project with the Cree Nation in Rocky Boy, Montana. We kind of structured it after wildland firefighting crew and to work on conservation issues within the tribal nation. So we offered it to the tribe and they accepted. We worked with their natural resource department. Projects we worked on was ag resource management plan, which the Bureau of Indian Affairs requests that the tribes get done every so often. We also worked on a biocontrol project and then a wildlife habitat project. And some of the future I think one of the best benefit we got out of that was the cultural aspect that we decided to go with it is to help with their cultural ceremonies that year. So we help clear the brush and build their sweat houses and help with putting up their teepees for their cultural practices. At that time, the tribal elders in the community came and told stories about natural resource management in the past and how they remember things when they were a youth. And oral history is very important to Native communities, and that's how we we kind of govern ourselves off of those the oral history. Some of our projects for the future, we're going to expand to 6 locations this year within tribal nations, and they're going to be working on rangeland assessments, livestock production, forest seeding, and hide tunnel farming. And so we're hoping this will, we're working with the higher risk youth in the community. And so that the 6 that we employed last year, 2 of them got hired with their natural resource department upon completion. So that was pretty neat. But we're hoping as we move forward, these youth will be the future managers of these 55 million acre tribal trust lands, and which will also reinforce our tribal food sovereignty and our local food system. If we ever come upon a pandemic in the future or any kind of natural disasters, we'll be more prepared for it. Thank you.
Excellent. Duke, do you want to hop in?
Sure. Thank you. We have a leadership management program we call Rangelands Management Guild that's been in existence for 20 years. And basically it takes young people who are interested in ranching and trains them in how we see ranching and conservation. And so basically it's not an academic program. It's more come and we'll give you a lot of responsibility and we'll look over your shoulder, but we'll let you make mistakes And so your knowledge level increases through actually going out every day and overseeing a herd, and the grazing planning and its health, the processing, actually physical moving it, going to conferences, having workshops led by people like Kurt Gadzia. And these young people will graduate after between 2 and 6 years, and we commit to them to either join us as a partner, where they would become part of our group more formally in managing ranches, or find them an opportunity with another ranch that's commensurate with their level of skill. And just as it's very difficult because ranching is so traditional for people to get in. And so it's great that you guys are doing what you're doing, Delaney, because it's so important to get these young people in. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way, Leslie, a great segue, Leslie, to some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so we have a program. Well, I'm back up really quick before I talk about our Women in Ranching program, but I will say that one of the most important things I will point out is the economics again, because if people can't earn a livelihood from the land, then the young generation can't buy it, can't afford to be out on the land. And so creating livelihoods that support land health and agriculture are really critical right now. So that's an important piece in this whole question, economics. But we also are working with a Women in Ranching program for the last several years that is really exciting. It's got a lot of excitement among women across the West. Women have always been part of ranching. I mean, most ranches had a husband-wife, team on it at some point. And women have had a big role behind the scenes in many cases in ranching, but they've always been there. They've often been invisible in some cases, and they're often isolated from one another. And at the same time, we have this new generation of young women who are eager to be out on the land, to learn how to steward it well. It's a great place to raise a family. It's a great lifestyle. They're eager to be physical and outdoors. But they struggle if they didn't grow up on a family ranch, even if they married into it, they struggle to get out on land and to become integrated in the ranching community. There are, sometimes self-confidence issues that come if you're a young woman, brand new to ranching. How do you get the skills that you need? How do you have the confidence? How do you get to the level of being a manager or being a ranch owner at some point? So that path can be challenging. So this program connects women, both who've been in ranching forever and those who are coming into it, younger, older women, all levels, who are living and working in very remote places around the West, in ranching and land stewardship generally. And it creates forums for them to come together. This year it's been virtual forums, of course, because of COVID, but typically they would be in-person gatherings on a ranch where we can both help provide some education about land management and stewardship. These are regeneratively managed ranches. So they're getting that education, they're building a personal and professional network, and they're getting that confidence boost to go out there and tackle it. And sometimes you really need that. And it's been a life-changing program for a lot of these young women. I've had women come to me that said, growing up on a ranch, Dad wouldn't let me do this or that. I didn't learn those skills, but he's passed on and now I have the ranch and I got to figure out how to rope and brand and, do all the things I need to do, run the business side. And this network of women is great for that kind of knowledge sharing. It's a very safe space for women to learn from one another. And it's been quite a powerful program. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. And Neo, I know that you've spent quite a bit of time overseeing the youth education programs for Africa People and Wildlife as well. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, most definitely. For us, we've been doing a lot of youth education in schools, that is primary schools and high school for a while, imparting that knowledge back to the youth. And basically, we have been doing it in terms of clubs in primary schools but also a unique opportunity to attend what we refer to as summer camps. It's a unique opportunity out here, and I think no one else does it in Tanzania. A 1 week long summer camp that brings together kids from different areas to come and learn on issues regarding rangelands, conservation, among others. Also, we have a full ride scholarship from high school to the university that we offer to kids. And as a matter of fact, now we have a kid who has graduated to be practice animal husbandry. Probably you'll go into that line of range management. And also we have a medical doctor, among others. Then I'll pass to Charles and talk a little bit about the new citizen science program.
Yeah, thanks. Just to finish off there, we're also now launching a youth citizen science program, which is basically trying to provide opportunities for students that are in the wildlife clubs to have the opportunity to work alongside our program officers in the various communities and to actually assist hands-on with various aspects of all of our programs, learn some of the technological advances that we're using, that communities are using now to monitor and collect data across their landscapes, and to actually help collect that data and to get interested in other aspects of rangeland management that they wouldn't necessarily be exposed to either in the school systems or even culturally and traditionally at home. I mean, the children still are the main herders. They're the ones that take the livestock out during the day and bring them back. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're involved in any of the discussions or the decision-making process, you know, because as the children, they really don't have a voice. So exposing them early on to what is needed is where we're hoping to go with that.
Great. Well, that's all we have time for, but thanks to all of you so much. You've given us so much to think about. It's inspiring to hear about, you know, what might happen in the future based on all of the work that you're doing. And I'm so grateful to you and all of the folks out there who are stewarding our private lands. So thanks to each of you. And yeah.
Well, thank you, Shannon. It was great. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion and engage others in it. Thank you.
Thanks for the
likewise. Thanks for the invite. Really appreciate it. And it was a pleasure meeting everyone. And I learned quite a bit.
Me too. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.